She didn't move. Marlo Voss stood behind the glass door and watched her daughter cross the yard toward a stranger. A man crouched in the early light, hands moving over wood with a patience that couldn't be performed. Callum Reeves didn't look up. He kept working, slow and deliberate, the wood making a low rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. Nora stopped 3 steps behind him. She had not spoken in 3 years. She had not walked toward a stranger without being led. She stood still. Then she opened her mouth. No sound came, but her lips moved. Marlo pressed her hand against her chest and forgot, for a moment, how to breathe. 48 hours earlier, Marlo had not planned to bring Nora to Ashford at all. The trip was supposed to be simple. 3 days in a Vermont town she'd never heard of before her acquisition team flagged the property a former community center on the edge of town. Square footage generous enough for a research annex, price low enough to make financial sense, and far enough from Boston that no one would ask questions about why Voss Therapeutics needed a satellite location so quickly. She would supervise the initial renovation assessment, sign what needed signing, and leave by Thursday. Nora was supposed to stay in Boston with her usual caregiver, a steady woman named Gail, who understood Nora's routines and knew not to fill the silences. But Tuesday morning, Nora had woken in the grip of something that sent Gail into the hallway, calling Marlo's name at 6 a.m. A panic so complete the child had folded herself under her bed and stayed there for 2 hours, trembling, unreachable. The pediatric neurologist said afterward what he always said: minimize transitions, avoid new environments, maintain predictability. And then he paused and said what he had never said before: unless the new environment is one she chooses to enter. Marlo didn't entirely know what that meant, but she put Nora in the car. Ashford received them without fanfare. The town ran along a river, 2 churches, a grain elevator that no longer stored grain, and enough maple trees to make the October light look like something filtered through stained glass. The building Marlo had purchased sat at the end of a side street, 2 stories, brick facade, 12,000 square feet of potential that currently smelled like dust and old radiator heat. The property manager had arranged for a local contractor to handle the renovation, a man named Bert Hadley, who shook Marlo's hand with both of his and said Callum Reeves was the best finished carpenter in the county and that she was lucky to get him on short notice. Callum Reeves arrived at 8 the next morning. He pulled up in a truck that had seen better decades, unloaded a canvas bag of tools without hurrying, walked the building in silence for 20 minutes while Marlo followed at a professional distance, and then stopped in the main room and said, "The northwest corner is your acoustic problem. Everything you put in that corner will sound wrong. You'll want to address that before you touch the walls." It wasn't a question. Marlo made a note and said she would look into it. He nodded once and went to work. She had been around men who knew things. They usually wanted her to know that they knew things. Callum Reeves spoke like a man reporting weather conditions present, factual, unbothered by whether she found it impressive. She found it strange. That evening, Eli came with him. The boy was 10, dark-haired, narrow-shouldered, with a seriousness around the eyes that didn't quite match his age. He settled on the back steps with a paperback and a granola bar, and made no demands of anyone. Nora, who had been moving through the building's back hallways in the quiet, sideways way she moved through all new places, stopped when she passed the window that overlooked the steps. Eli looked up. He raised one hand in a loose wave, the way you might greet someone you saw every Tuesday. Nora didn't wave back, but she didn't move away from the window either. She stood there and watched him read. And Marlo, watching from across the room, felt 2 things at once: the reflex to go get her daughter and the weight of something she couldn't name that said don't. She stayed where she was. Before he left that night, Callum stopped at the table where Marlo had spread out the preliminary plans. He picked up one sheet, studied it for a moment, and asked, "What's the ceiling height in the northeast room?" The original plans say 11 feet, but the proportions read closer to 9. Marlo said she would check. He set the sheet down. The question was precise in a way that took a specific kind of knowledge to form, but she let it pass. She told herself she would ask him about it later. She didn't sleep well that night. He arrived before 7 the next morning, with a different set of tools. Marlo noticed because she had already been up for an hour. Standing in the kitchen of the rented house she'd taken 2 blocks from the property, drinking coffee in the gray light and thinking about nothing productive. She heard the truck. She watched from the kitchen window as he carried something inside flat wooden panels, different sizes, bound with cord-knot tools she associated with renovation work. She waited. By the time she crossed the yard to the building, he had set up in the main room and was working one of the panels with a hand plane, drawing it slowly across the surface, listening to the sound it made. He adjusted the angle, drew it again, stopped. He was building something from the wood itself, shaping it into a curved geometry she didn't immediately recognize. Then she did. Sound diffusion panels. The kind used in therapeutic spaces, in rooms designed for children who experienced the world through their nervous systems before they processed it through language. The kind of work that required knowing not just joinery but acoustics, the precise relationship between surface geometry and how sound traveled, and how a room could feel safe to a body that didn't have words for safe. Nora appeared in the doorway while Marlowe was still standing in the corner watching. Callum didn't look up. His hands kept moving, and the wood kept making it sound a soft, structured percussion, the same rhythm repeated, as consistent as breathing, not performing for anyone, not stopping, just continuing, as though the room's new occupant was weather, present and accounted for. Nora moved inside. She sat on the floor, 2 feet behind him, and watched his hands. Marlowe went to her laptop. She searched his name, Callum Reeves, carpenter, Ashford, Vermont, and found a local business listing, 3 years old, no website. She refined the search. Callum Reeves, architect. She refined it again. Callum Reeves, therapeutic design. The third result stopped her. Reeves, Therapeutic Spaces, Boston, Massachusetts. Principal architect, Callum Reeves. Pioneering sensory integrated design for nonverbal children and youth with complex trauma, 2009 through 2021. She sat still. She found the firm's archived portfolio. 12 completed projects across 6 states' hospitals, pediatric centers, residential treatment facilities, every space designed around the premise that a child who couldn't speak could still respond to the language a room spoke to them. Light, texture, proportion, the way sound moved between surfaces. 3 peer-reviewed papers, a keynote address at a conference she had attended, and where she had not met him, though she had been standing 30 feet from where his name appeared in the program. She understood, in one clean moment, why Nora had not been afraid of him. He had spent 12 years learning exactly how not to frighten a child like her. Marlowe looked up from the screen. Across the room, Eli was coming through the back door carrying 2 cups of water. He set 1 cup on the floor beside Nora without saying anything about it, without making it a thing, and walked back to his book. Nora looked at the cup, looked at Eli's retreating back. Then she reached out and touched the rim of it with 2 fingers light, provisional, as though she was testing whether it was real. It was the first time in 3 years she had accepted something offered by a stranger. Marlowe turned her face away from both children and pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth. Why had he walked away from all of it? And did he know she knew? She chose not to say anything. This was not how Marlowe Voss typically operated. She was the woman who surfaced information and immediately deployed it. When she knew something useful about someone, she used the knowledge to establish the terms of a relationship before the other person had a chance to. It was not cruelty, it was efficiency. It was how she had built Voss Therapeutics from a licensing operation into a $2.4 billion company without losing a hostile board vote in 11 years. But she watched Callum work through the morning and could not locate the angle. If she told him she knew who he was, what would that accomplish? He would either confirm it and feel the shape of the conversation shift around him, or he would not confirm it, and they would both be standing in a lie she had introduced. Either way, she would lose the thing she was, for reasons she hadn't examined, reluctant to disturb. He noticed that she was watching him differently. She could tell because he became quieter in the way that watchful people become quiet, when they sense they've been seen, not withdrawal exactly, but a certain closing of the periphery. He kept his eyes on his work. He moved with the same deliberate economy he'd brought to every task, but the space between them had changed texture, and he felt it. By mid-morning, Nora and Eli had established something that could not quite be called a friendship, and could not quite be called anything else. Eli talked. Not too much. He had his father's sense of proportion, but steadily, in the way of a person who had learned that silence doesn't always mean disinterest. He told Nora about a bird he'd seen that morning, a great blue heron standing in the field at the edge of town like it owned the property. He said he'd looked it up, and apparently they can stand still for 45 minutes waiting for a fish, which seemed like more patience than he personally had. He paused at regular intervals, leaving space. Nora pulled a small notepad from her jacket pocket and wrote something, held it up. It said, "Do they catch the fish?" Eli read it, looked up, said, "Sometimes." He seemed to find this satisfying. He went back to his book. Marlo watched from 3 rooms away with the specific feeling of witnessing something she didn't know how to categorize: relief, tangled with something sharper, something she preferred not to name. Derek Holt came at 2 in the afternoon. He was 52, broad-shouldered, with the kind of tan that came from golf courses and the kind of smile that had practiced itself into something that resembled warmth from the right distance. He said he'd heard Marlo was in town and wanted to stop by and welcome her personally. He sat on the planning board, had been on it for 9 years, and liked to make sure new investors in Ashford knew they had a friend in local government. He looked around the building while he talked, which told her everything. Marlo offered him coffee and let him say his piece. He circled around the property, eventually mentioned that his investment group had looked at this parcel 2 years ago, very interesting bones, and that he understood she'd paid fair value. But if the renovation costs turned out to be prohibitive, his group might be interested in a conversation. She said she appreciated the offer. She said the renovation was proceeding smoothly. She held his eyes with the steady courtesy she had spent decades sharpening into something that could not be argued with. He left. That evening Callum was packing up, and Marlo was standing near the window, and the light had gone amber and long across the floor between them. She was not trying to start a conversation, but she heard herself ask it anyway. "Your son, where did you teach him not to ask questions about people?" He stopped, didn't look up right away, set a tool down and then looked at her, and she held the look. "I taught him that sometimes silence isn't an answer," he said. "Sometimes it's a question." He picked up his bag and left. Marlo stayed where she was for a while after. 3 days moved past in the particular rhythm that forms when people are working alongside each other without explicitly agreeing to. Callum arrived early and worked until 5. Nora, each morning, appeared at the edge of the room where he was. Each morning she was slightly closer than the day before, not by much, never suddenly, more like the way a tide moves, too gradually to watch, and then you look again and it's somewhere else. No one mentioned it. No one made it a milestone. It simply was what it was. He explained things to Eli as he worked. Not in the way of adults who perform knowledge for children fully, without condescension, the way he would explain to a colleague who was curious. He talked about the difference between pine and maple in terms of how they handled sound. He said pine absorbs, maple reflects. He showed Eli how to tap a panel in different places and hear the variation. He said every material has a voice, the same way every room has a temperature that isn't about heat. Nora took out her notepad. She wrote something and held it up. Eli leaned over and read it, then looked at Callum. "She wants to know if different shapes make different sounds." Callum looked at her. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly right. The curve changes the path." He showed her, holding a curved panel so she could tap it herself. She did barely a touch, more test than contact. Then she tapped it again, a little firmer. A small furrow appeared between her eyebrows. Processing. Marlo was at her desk in the back office, reviewing old project files. She had found the Meridian Children's Center. She had known about it in the abstract, a proposed pediatric therapeutic campus in Boston's South End, 2019. A coalition of private and philanthropic funders. Her team had submitted a proposal on behalf of Voss Therapeutics to participate in the funding structure. The application had been declined, reason cited as funding cohort complete. She had not thought about it since. The lead architect's name had been Reeves. She had not connected the name to the man in front of her. She connected it now. She set the file down and sat there. Her phone rang. Dr. Patel, from the pediatric behavioral team in Boston. She picked up. He said the things he always said. Nora's progress required controlled therapeutic exposure, trained facilitators, evidence-based engagement protocols, incidental contact with unfamiliar adults outside of clinical settings, however well-intentioned, was not equivalent to therapeutic intervention, and could in fact introduce unpredictable variables that complicated treatment planning. He was not wrong. He was never wrong. He was among the best pediatric behavioral specialists in the country, and he cared about Nora with something that went beyond professional obligation. Marlowe looked out the window. Nora was sitting on the floor 3 feet from Callum, pointing at something in the wood grain. He looked where she pointed. He said something quiet. She tipped her head and looked again. Marlowe had a thought she did not allow herself to finish, and said yes. She understood, and thanked him and ended the call. The notice from the Ashford Planning and Zoning Board arrived as an email, copied to Marlowe's project manager and her legal team simultaneously, which told her it was not an administrative oversight. The subject line cited procedural review of construction permits for properties within the historic district, overlay a vague category she had not known applied to this parcel. The technical objections were written with the careful vagueness of language designed not to be obviously wrong, while also not being specific enough to be easily refuted. She read it twice and recognized the authorship without needing a name attached. She forwarded it to her general counsel in Boston and spent the afternoon on calls. The attorneys were measured. They said these types of challenges were common in small municipalities when outside money arrived, that they were rarely decisive, and that the response timeline was manageable. She said she understood. She ended the call feeling none of the things the attorney's measured tone was designed to produce. Holt, meanwhile, had been speaking with Bert Hadley. Bert was not a man who would deliberately harm anyone, but he was a man who talked when talked to, and what he knew about Callum Reeves, which was not much, had apparently been enough to make Holt curious. Marlowe learned this from Bert himself, who called her apologetically that afternoon to say that Derek had stopped by the shop asking questions. He'd only said that Callum was the best he'd ever seen with a hand plane, and that he'd shown up in town about 4 years back. He'd mentioned Callum had a boy with him. He said he hoped that was all right. Marlowe said it was fine. She didn't know exactly what Holt was looking for. She had a precise idea of what he might find if he looked carefully enough, and this was a different kind of problem. She thought about telling Callum. She thought about why she kept deciding not to. She told herself it was because she didn't yet have enough information to be useful. She was not entirely convinced. That evening she was still at her desk at 9 when she heard a knock at the door. She said, "Come in." Callum came in carrying a folder, not large, maybe 20 pages, and he set it on the table without preamble and stepped back. She opened it. The project's technical documentation had been completely rewritten. Every element the notice had cited as potentially non-compliant had been addressed with specific citations to applicable Vermont statutes and current building codes, with the language precise and comprehensive in the way that requires not just knowledge of construction, but knowledge of how regulatory frameworks are structured and where they are vulnerable to challenge. A Finnish carpenter, however skilled, does not produce this kind of document. She looked at the folder. She looked at him. "I don't want to see this project stopped," he said. He left. Marlowe sat for a long time after, in the quiet room with the folder in front of her, the building settling around her in the way old buildings settle at night. Small sounds, adjustments, the structure accommodating itself to the temperature. She thought about what he had said and what he hadn't, and about the specific distance between those two things. Was he protecting the project, or something the project contained? And who had told him what Holt was actually after? She went to the library the next morning. Ruth Calloway had been running the Ashford Public Library for 22 years, a fact visible in the way she inhabited the building, not like an employee and not quite like an owner, more like a person who has organized their life around a place until the place has organized itself around them in return. She was 68, unhurried, with reading glasses on a chain and a manner that suggested she found most situations interesting rather than alarming. Marlowe came for the property records. Ashford's planning files before 2010 existed on paper, cataloged in the library's archive room because the town had never funded a digitization project. Ruth found them without complaint and showed her to a table. They talked while Marlowe worked. Ruth asked how the renovation was going. Marlowe said well. Ruth said Callum Reeves was a good choice, that she couldn't think of anyone she'd trust more with a building that deserved attention. Marlowe said she'd found his work to be exceptional. Ruth said, "It always was." Even before and then she stopped. Marlowe looked up. Ruth was looking at her with the expression of someone who has said slightly more than they intended to and is now assessing the damage. "Before," Marlowe said. Ruth took a breath, set her glasses on the table. She said, I knew who he was before he came to Ashford. I'd read about Meridian. When he showed up here and didn't say anything about it, I understood that was a choice he was making. I've respected that choice for 4 years. Marlowe said nothing. Ruth said, his wife's name was Claire. She was killed by a driver who ran a red light on Commonwealth Avenue. It was the 14th of March, 2020. The Meridian Children's Center was scheduled to open on the 20th of that same month. It was the culmination of everything he'd spent 12 years building, a space designed specifically for children who communicated outside of language. Non-verbal children. Children like she paused. Children who needed what he knew how to build. Marlowe was very still. He couldn't go in, Ruth said. After Claire died, he couldn't walk through those doors. The project opened without him. He gave the lead to a junior architect, signed over the completion credits, packed what he and Eli needed, and drove north. He bought back his parents' land outside of town for what it had been listed at in 1998, and he stayed. She paused again. He's not hiding. He just couldn't go back to who he was. He could only go forward as someone smaller. The archive room was very quiet. Marlowe said, Derek Holt came to you. Ruth said, last week. He asked what I knew about Callum. I told him I knew he was a reliable carpenter and a good father. She did not say whether she was worried, but Marlowe could see that she was. On the walk back, she came around a corner and found Callum 20 feet ahead, standing at the edge of the schoolyard. Eli was coming through the gate, backpack low on his shoulders, already talking before he'd fully reached his father, something about a map project, something about the Revolutionary War, and a teacher who got the dates wrong, his hands moving with the particular energy of a child who has been saving up sentences all day. Callum crouched down to Eli's level, unhurried, and listened with the whole of his attention, not waiting for the child to finish, actually listening. Marlowe stopped walking. What she felt standing there had no efficient name. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't tenderness, and it wasn't yet anything she was ready to examine directly. It was closer to the thing that happens when you've been looking at something from a wrong angle for a long time, and then something moves, and the angle corrects, and the thing becomes what it actually is. She stood there until they turned and walked the other direction. Then she walked back to the building alone. He finished the room on a Thursday morning. No one had commissioned it specifically. The work order covered the main hall, the 2 front offices, and the storage access on the north end. The small room off the east corridor, barely 400 square feet. A former supply closet expanded at some point into something that didn't quite know what it was, had not been on the list. But when Marlowe came in that morning, the smell of fresh sawdust and something else, something clean and resinous, led her to the doorway. The walls were paneled in pale maple. The curved diffusion panels Callum had been building fitted between structural elements in a pattern that drew the eye without demanding it. The ceiling was lower than the rest of the building by 8 inches, which should have felt confining and instead felt held. A single window, narrow, placed high on the south wall, let light in at an angle that changed slowly across the floor as the morning progressed. In the corner, not centered, not prominent, just present a small wooden chair, child-sized, with a cushion in a color that was almost not a color at all. A pale gray that the room received without argument. Callum found her standing in the doorway. He didn't explain himself. He said, Eli's inside, if you want to come find them. She did. Eli was already in the room, turning slowly with his arms out, looking at the ceiling. He was telling Nora something. Marlowe couldn't hear the words from the hall, just the cadence, and Nora was standing in the middle of the floor with her face tilted up, and when Eli finished whatever he was saying, she took 1 step toward the chair and stopped. Callum walked out of the building through the front and onto the porch. He did not look at Nora. He did not issue permission or invitation. He simply removed himself from the equation. Nora stood there for a long moment. Then she walked to the chair and sat down. The room did what Callum had built it to do. The sound from outside wind moving through the maple trees along the street, the far sound of a car, someone's voice a block away came through the narrow window, transformed, softened, arranged by the panels into something the body could hold without bracing. Nora looked up at the ceiling. She breathed. Her hands, which were usually held close to her sides, opened slightly in her lap, and then she opened her mouth. The sound that came out was almost nothing. A small, hoarse push of air that formed almost into a shape and then dissolved. It was not a word. It was not recognizable as language. It was sound, the first sound Nora Voss had produced in 3 years, and it lasted less than 2 seconds. Eli stood very still. He did not shout. He did not move toward her or reach for her or do anything that would make the moment about him. He looked at her with an expression of careful, serious regard, and nodded once. Marlo was at the door of the room. She did not know when she had moved there. She watched her daughter sit in the small chair in the maple-paneled room that a man had built without being asked, and she felt her knees soften, and she put one hand against the doorframe and pressed her shoulder against the wall. The sound Marlo made was very small, but Callum, on the porch, heard it. He came to the corridor. He looked through the doorway at Nora, still sitting, and at Eli standing nearby, and at Marlo with her back against the wall. He understood immediately. He stayed where he was. When Marlo came out 5 minutes later, she stood beside him on the porch, and neither of them said anything for a long time. The street was quiet, just the maple trees doing what maple trees do in October, which is disagree loudly with the wind about staying attached. "You knew," she said finally. "You knew what that room would do." Not present tense, past tense, not a question. "I hoped," he said. The word landed in the space between them and sat there. The letter arrived on a Friday, delivered by process server to the project site. Holt's attorneys had identified a technical compliance issue. Callum's architectural license was registered in Massachusetts. Vermont required a separate reciprocal registration for any professional practicing in the state. The letter, alleged unlicensed professional practice, demanded an immediate halt to all construction activities pending investigation by the Vermont Secretary of State's office, and copied the relevant regulatory body. It was competently written. It had cost Holt something to produce, and he had produced it anyway, which meant he had decided to stop probing and start pressing. Callum read it standing at the workbench. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket and went back to work for 40 minutes before he sat down. Marlo found out the same way Ashford found out Holt had sent a copy of a public statement to the Ashford Register, the weekly paper, which posted its content online that same afternoon. The headline was procedurally careful and personally pointed in the way that local news sometimes managed to be both. She called Callum. He didn't answer. She drove to his house. The house was a cape on a dirt road outside of town, the kind of structure that had been added to over decades without anyone worrying too much about the additions matching each other. It was small, and it was orderly. Firewood stacked against the south wall, a pair of boots on the step, a child's bicycle leaning against the fence in a way that suggested the child had left it there in a hurry, and it had been there ever since. Callum opened the door. She had been inside for less than 30 seconds before she saw the drawings. They covered the wall of the room that served as both dining room and study blueprints, detailed pencil drawings, technical elevations pinned at angles with the particular disorder of someone who had been looking at them and never quite putting them away. Meridian. She recognized the floor plan from the archived portfolio she'd studied. She recognized the notations in the margins, his handwriting, specific, technical, and also the handwriting of a person who had been in conversation with the drawings for a very long time. He had never taken them down. He explained the legal situation with the flatness of someone describing a mechanical problem. Vermont reciprocal licensure. Timeline for application, likelihood of the regulatory body taking any action given the specifics of his engagement and the nature of the work performed, which fell under renovation supervision rather than original design. He said Holt was not actually going to win this, and he knew it. He said he had just not expected the public component. Marlo said, "Why didn't you tell me about the license issue when you started?" He said, "Because it was my problem and not yours." She said, "You were working on my building." The silence after that was the kind that has weight. He sat with it. She sat with it. Who was going to stop Holt? And what would it cost Callum to have his name become public property in this town he had built a quiet life inside? Her legal team was thorough and fast. She gave them one instruction. Holt. Everything. 10 years of planning board decisions, land transactions, zoning variance approvals, contractor relationships. Find the structure. They found it in 6 hours. A pattern of consulting fees paid to a real estate advisory LLC incorporated in Delaware. Holt's son was a registered agent, a detail that took 11 minutes to surface from 6 different developers who had received favorable treatment on variance applications during Holt's tenure. The amounts were not enormous individually. Collectively they were. The pattern was clear enough that Marlowe's general counsel said, "He'll pull the letter before we have to file anything." He was right. By Monday morning the letter was withdrawn. The public statement was retracted with language about ongoing review and procedural clarification, and Derek Holt had developed what his assistant described to the Register as a pressing family commitment that would take him out of town for the foreseeable future. The building permit was reinstated. The project continued, but the Register had already run the story. Not Holt's version, a follow-up piece more carefully reported by a local journalist who had found Callum's professional history interesting enough to investigate without prompting. The headline was respectful. The details were accurate. By Wednesday, Ashford knew that its best Finnish carpenter was also, or had been, one of the foremost therapeutic architects in the country. Callum walked through the hardware store that morning and felt the difference. People looked at him and then looked away, or looked at him and said something, it didn't matter which, because both were the same shape of attention, the kind he had spent 4 years living without. He came home and stood in the kitchen for a while. Eli came home from school that afternoon, quiet in a particular way. He did his homework. He ate dinner. He cleared his plate. Then he came and sat on the couch next to his father. He said, "People were talking at school about you." Callum said, "I know." Eli said, "I knew you weren't actually just a carpenter. I just didn't ask because you'd say it when you were ready." Callum looked at his son. He tried to say something and found he didn't have it yet. He put his hand on the back of Eli's head, briefly, the way you do when there aren't words, and Eli let him. The next morning, Callum found a folded piece of paper on the workbench. He didn't know how Nora had gotten there without anyone seeing her. He unfolded it. Inside was a drawing in pencil, careful, deliberate lines, the hand of a child who looked closely before she committed. The small room, the chair in the corner, the narrow window with its diagonal light, and in the doorway, 2 figures. One taller, one not. Neither one labeled. He stood at the workbench for a long time holding the paper. The renovation finished in the 3rd week of October, when Vermont stopped being moderate about autumn and committed fully. The maples along the road on fire, the mornings precise and cold, the sky that specific blue that appears only after the first hard frost. Holt was gone from public life, or at least from visible life. The planning board had reviewed what needed reviewing. Ashford returned to its routines. Callum did not return to the version of himself from 3 weeks earlier. Something in his quietness had changed texture. It was no longer the silence of someone who had stopped expecting anything. It was the silence of a man deciding. Marlowe found him in the small maple room on the last afternoon, checking the panels. She stood in the doorway. She said, "I want to make you a formal offer. Not finish work." Lead design architect for the Voss Therapeutic Spaces program, Ashford, and 3 properties in pre-acquisition, full authority over spatial decisions. He was quiet long enough that she thought he would say no. He said, "The last time I designed a room for a child who couldn't speak, I wasn't there when the door opened." She waited. He said, "If I do this again, I need to know I'll be there." She understood he was not talking about buildings. She said yes. The last morning came the way they always do, a little abruptly, with a logic that had been moving toward it the whole time. Nora found him before anyone else arrived. She walked through the unlocked front door and went directly to the main hall where he was doing a final pass on the floor seams. She stood in front of him. He looked at her. She looked back directly, with the focused commitment of someone who has been rehearsing something alone. Then she spoke. 2 syllables, separated, placed with precision. "Thank you." Callum did not speak. He lowered himself to one knee, unhurriedly, and looked at her, and nodded once slowly, the way you confirm something that matters and cannot be returned. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she turned and walked out. When Marlowe arrived an hour later, she could tell from the way Nora moved, lighter, different, not triumphant, but released, that something had happened. She didn't ask. She let it belong to Nora. The car came at 11. Nora stood on the sidewalk with her jacket buttoned and her notepad in her pocket. Callum came to the porch steps. 20 feet of street separated them, enough distance that neither had to manage their expression. Marlowe took out a card. Small, cream-colored, personal, her name, and a handwritten number, and the address of her office in Boston. She held it out. He came down and took it. She didn't say anything. He turned it over. He held it without putting it away. The car pulled out. He stood on the sidewalk and watched it reach the corner and disappear. Eli came and stood beside him. "Are you going to call them?" Callum looked at the card. He looked at his son. He looked at the empty corner of the road. And for the first time in 4 years, he smiled, not the managed version he produced for public occasions, but the real thing, arriving without permission, and it did not hurt. It felt like the first morning of something he didn't have a name for yet but intended, this time, to stay long enough to find out.